kitchen was quiet except for the gentle clink of silverware against porcelain. I watched my wife's face across our dinner table in our Austin home, the soft glow of pendant lights hanging above us, casting shadows that made her expression even harder to read than usual. Emily twirled her fork absently through the pasta I'd spent an hour preparing, something clearly off in her demeanor. For weeks, she'd been distant, working late, checking her phone constantly, giving those half smiles that never reached her eyes. Tonight was different, though, with a determination in her posture that sent a chill down my spine. "Michael," she said finally, her voice eerily calm while still refusing to meet my gaze. "I need to talk to you about something important that's been on my mind lately." I set down my glass of wine with deliberate slowness. "I'm listening to whatever you have to say." She took a deep breath that seemed to last forever. "I want to pause our marriage for a while." The words hung in the air between us like toxic smoke. I felt my heart skip a beat but kept my face carefully neutral as I processed what she was suggesting. "Pause," I repeated with measured control. "Not separate, not divorce. Pause, like our 10 years together was some Netflix show she could return to whenever she felt bored with other options." "Just for a few weeks while I'm away," Emily continued, her voice controlled with practiced precision. "I have that business trip to London coming up, and I think some time apart would be healthy for both of us. I need to be alone, figure things out, find myself again without distractions." I noticed she was fidgeting with her wedding ring, twisting it around her finger nervously, a habit I'd seen countless times over the years, usually right before she told me something she knew would hurt me. "Find yourself," I echoed, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "And what exactly does that entail when you're thousands of miles away from our marriage?" Her eyes flashed defensively across the table. "It's not about anything specific or someone else, Michael. I just need space to think clearly. Everything feels suffocating lately in ways I can't fully explain." "Suffocating," I repeated, letting the accusation in the word hang between us. "That's quite the description for a marriage that was supposedly built on love and mutual respect." "That's not entirely fair to what we've built together," she said quickly, her tone shifting to something more placating. "You must understand what I mean on some level. We've been together since college without any real breaks. Sometimes I wonder if I even know who I am outside of being your wife and all these roles I play." I laid down my fork and knife with deliberate calm, the kitchen suddenly feeling too warm and constraining. My next words surprised even me with their clarity and conviction. "If hitting pause is your way to find some elusive truth, Emily, then you should know mine right now. I, Dewey Yuri, won't be waiting on standby while you explore your options elsewhere." Her eyes finally met mine fully, widening slightly with unmistakable surprise. This wasn't the compliant response she'd come to expect after years of conditioning. In our marriage, I'd always been the peacekeeper, the one who compromised first to maintain harmony. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" she asked, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. "It means precisely what I said without hidden meanings. You want space and freedom? Take all you need. But understand that I'm not putting my life on hold while you find yourself in London or anywhere else. You're deliberately making this into something it absolutely isn't," she said, her voice rising slightly with frustration. "I'm not asking for permission to cheat on you or explore other relationships. I just need some time to think without constant pressure. And I need a wife who doesn't treat our marriage like a streaming subscription," I countered, surprised by my own boldness after years of careful diplomacy. "One that can be canceled and renewed whenever convenient for just one party." Emily pushed her plate away, the pasta barely touched despite my efforts. "This reaction is exactly why I need space from us. Everything becomes a dramatic confrontation lately instead of a rational discussion." I almost laughed at the audacious irony of her statement. For years, she'd been the one manufacturing drama while I walked on eggshells trying to maintain peace between us. "When exactly do you leave?" I asked with newfound calmness. "Sunday morning at 8 a.m., she replied, looking almost relieved that I wasn't fighting harder against her decision. "The company booked an early flight to maximize the first day there." "Fine then. I'll help you pack tomorrow if you need assistance," I offered with surprising detachment. Later that night, as Emily slept beside me, or pretended to, I stared at the ceiling and realized something startling that I hadn't expected. I felt lighter somehow, as though an invisible weight I hadn't even recognized was lifting off my chest. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a life where I wasn't constantly trying to keep Emily happy at the expense of my own needs. A life where I could finally breathe without judgment. The sound of the front door closing behind Emily echoed through our house with surprising finality. I stood motionless in the entryway, staring at the space where she'd been moments before. Her suitcase wheels had left faint tracks on our hardwood floors, the only evidence she'd been here at all. The house felt utterly quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years of shared living. I took a deep breath that filled my lungs completely, then another even deeper one. And then, unexpectedly and almost guiltily, I smiled with genuine relief. I walked deliberately to our kitchen, made myself a cup of coffee with the expensive beans she always complained were overpriced, and sat at the breakfast bar. No rushing to accommodate Emily's demanding schedule. No careful conversation calibrated to avoid setting off her unpredictable moods. Just peaceful silence and the aromatic bitterness of dark roast coffee. That first day of freedom was strange yet exhilarating. I wandered through rooms that suddenly felt more spacious and welcoming. I turned up music she always complained was too loud. Classic rock and blues that filled every corner of the house without criticism. I ordered spicy Thai food she could never tolerate because of her sensitive palate, and ate it straight from the container while watching a documentary she would have dismissed as tediously boring. By the third day, I'd fallen into a remarkably liberating rhythm that felt increasingly natural. I woke early and went for invigorating runs along Lady Bird Lake as the sun rose over Austin with spectacular colors. I rediscovered the weight room at my gym, feeling long, neglected muscles ache with the satisfying pain of renewal. I stayed late at work without worrying about accusatory texts demanding to know my whereabouts and intentions. And in our garage, beneath a dusty cover that hadn't been disturbed in years, I uncovered my old Harley Davidson, a restoration project I'd reluctantly abandoned 3 years ago after one too many arguments about wasting time and money on that dangerous death trap. I pulled off the protective cover and ran my hand over the vintage tank with appreciation for its classic lines. The bike needed substantial work after years of neglect, but suddenly I had nothing but uninterrupted time and rediscovered enthusiasm to invest in something purely for my own satisfaction. That evening, my phone buzzed with an incoming text from Emily that broke my peaceful solitude. "London is absolutely amazing. The hotel has the most perfect view of Big Ben from my executive suite. How's everything going at home without me around?" I stared at the illuminated screen for a long, contemplative moment. What exactly was I supposed to say that wouldn't sound accusatory or petty? That I was unexpectedly happier than I'd been in months? That I was steadily rediscovering parts of myself I'd systematically buried to keep our fragile marriage functioning? Instead, I typed a response of measured neutrality. "Everything's perfectly fine here. Enjoy your business trip and the London experience." She responded almost immediately with obvious disappointment. "That's seriously it? Nothing else happening worth telling me about?" I set the phone down without bothering to reply and returned to the garage where the Harley demanded my focused attention far more than Emily's fishing for validation and reassurance. Later that night, as I was comfortably falling asleep in our bed that suddenly felt more spacious, my phone buzzed again with persistent neediness. "Do you miss me yet?" 3 simple words that would have once sent me scrambling to provide the emotional reassurance she constantly required. I lay in bed staring thoughtfully at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me. Did I genuinely miss her presence in our home? The question made me increasingly uncomfortable because I already knew the honest answer without needing to examine it further. "Glad you arrived safely in London. Take care of yourself, Emily." I sent the message and deliberately turned off my phone to ensure uninterrupted sleep. The next morning, I had a single-word response waiting for me that radiated cold disapproval. "Okay." I could practically feel the frigid disappointment through the screen. Typically, this passive-aggressive response would have immediately launched me into familiar damage control mode, calling repeatedly, apologizing profusely, sending expensive flowers to her hotel. Instead, I made myself a hearty breakfast and headed to work with a lightness in my step that colleagues immediately noticed and commented on positively. So let me get this completely straight. She just unilaterally decided to pause your marriage like it's some kind of streaming service subscription? What the actual hell does that even mean in reality? Derek asked incredulously, nursing his whiskey across the table from me with obvious disapproval. We were comfortably settled at the Rustic Tap, our long-established spot when we needed to have serious conversations away from judgmental ears. Derek had been my loyal best friend since our college days, long before Emily entered the picture with her whirlwind personality. He'd reluctantly served as the best man at our wedding, and over subsequent years I'd noticed him growing increasingly quiet whenever Emily's name came up in conversation. Honestly, I'm beginning to think it means she wanted to test exactly how far she could push before I finally broke under the pressure, I said reflectively, rolling the ice in my glass with deliberate movements. She fully expected me to beg her dramatically to reconsider leaving. Derek leaned forward with intensity. And why exactly didn't you follow the usual script? You've always been the one to cave first in every confrontation. The question stung precisely because it contained undeniable truth. For years, I'd consistently been the one to apologize first, to compromise my legitimate needs and wants for the sake of temporary domestic peace. I'm completely exhausted, man, I admitted with newfound honesty, tired of being the only one genuinely trying to make things work between us. It's like I suddenly looked up and realized I'd gradually transformed into someone I don't even recognize or respect anymore. Derek nodded slowly with evident understanding. Remember when you used to box competitively? When you rode that Harley everywhere without apology? When you didn't compulsively check your phone every 5 minutes to make absolutely sure she wasn't upset about something trivial? I've actually started working on restoring the bike again. I shared, feeling a small but meaningful surge of pride in the accomplishment. You're kidding me right now? Derek's face broke into a genuine smile of approval. That's legitimately the best news I've heard all year about your situation. The Harley needs substantial work after sitting neglected for so long, but she'll definitely run properly again with some dedicated attention. The motorcycle or your increasingly controlling wife? Derek asked with a knowing smirk that cut to the heart of the matter. I laughed genuinely, a real uninhibited laugh that felt surprisingly foreign, yet welcome in my chest after so long. Definitely the Harley. At least with the motorcycle, she only breaks down when there's actually something mechanically wrong that can be fixed with the right tools. Derek's expression turned seriously contemplative. Look, Michael, I've deliberately held my tongue for years because you seemed, content enough with your compromises. But since we're finally being brutally honest with each other, Emily's been systematically testing your boundaries for years now. She's been methodically seeing how much control you'll surrender, how much criticism and manipulation you'll tolerate without protest. You never particularly liked her, did you? I asked, suddenly realizing what should have been obvious years ago. I genuinely liked the vibrant woman you initially fell in love with during college, he said with careful consideration. But that authentic person disappeared gradually a long time ago. The Emily I've observed these past several years, she consistently treats you like an underperforming employee who's perpetually on probationary status needing to prove his worth. His words hit me with unexpected force because they perfectly articulated what I'd been feeling internally, but couldn't properly express even to myself. So what's my next move now that she's conveniently paused our marriage? I asked with genuine curiosity about his perspective. Derek looked me straight in the eye without hesitation. She's essentially testing whether she can run away without facing any meaningful consequences for her actions. Don't surrender that power to her manipulation. Use this pause she's created to thoroughly remember who you fundamentally are without her constant narrative controlling every aspect of your life. I took a contemplative sip of whiskey, letting the satisfying burn match the growing resolve building inside me with each passing day of freedom. I've already started that process of rediscovery, I told him with quiet determination. Excellent progress, Derek nodded approvingly. Because from where I'm sitting objectively, this supposed pause isn't actually a punishment, man. It's potentially the greatest gift she's ever given you without realizing it. As we left the welcoming bar that night, something fundamental shifted permanently inside my perspective. The persistent guilt I'd been unconsciously carrying, the nagging feeling that I should be fighting harder to preserve our increasingly dysfunctional marriage, began to dissolve completely. In its place emerged something that felt dangerously yet wonderfully like genuine hope for a different future. The boxing gym was discreetly tucked away in a renovated warehouse in East Austin's industrial district. I hadn't stepped through its doors in at least 4 years, not since Emily had pointedly observed that the occasional bruises on my knuckles appeared unprofessional and concerning for someone in corporate finance dealing with important clients. The familiar atmospheric scent hit my senses immediately upon entering. An unmistakable combination of honest sweat, well-worn leather, and industrial-strength disinfectant that somehow smelled like authentic purpose. The rhythmic percussion of gloves hitting heavy bags, the grunts of focused effort, the occasional shout of genuine encouragement created a symphony of dedication. It felt surprisingly like coming home to something essential I'd forgotten. "Well, look what the proverbial cat finally dragged in after all this time," a booming voice called out across the space. I turned to see Tony, the gym's longtime owner, grinning broadly at me from behind the scarred front desk. He'd put on noticeable weight around his middle, and his formerly dark beard now contained significant streaks of distinguished gray, but his evaluating eyes remained the same, sharp and perpetually assessing potential. "Been quite a while since my last appearance," I admitted with an appropriately sheepish smile of acknowledgement. "A while? Try a complete geological era or two," he laughed with genuine warmth. "Your membership expired somewhere during the Obama administration, if my records are accurate. Any reasonable chance you could hook me up with a temporary day pass? See if I remember anything useful about technique before committing again?" I asked hopefully. Tony waved his hand dismissively with characteristic generosity. "For you returning after exile, just sign the standard liability waiver and try not to dramatically expire on my recently cleaned floor. Your cardiovascular conditioning definitely ain't what it previously was. I'd confidently bet good money on that assessment." His prediction proved embarrassingly accurate. 20 intense minutes into jumping rope as basic warm-up, I found myself completely drenched in sweat and seriously questioning all my recent life decisions that led to this moment of humbling truth. But beneath the burning protest in my oxygen-deprived lungs pulsed an exhilarating sense of authentic aliveness I hadn't experienced in far too many years of comfortable corporate existence. "Your fundamental form is absolutely terrible from a technical standpoint," a confident female voice observed critically from directly behind me. I turned somewhat defensively to see a tall, athletic woman with dark hair pulled back in a professional-looking ponytail assessing my performance without sugarcoating. She wasn't conventionally beautiful in Emily's carefully maintained way, but there was something immediately striking about her uncompromising presence, a natural confidence that radiated from her comfortable stance and the way she didn't automatically smile to unnecessarily soften her technical criticism. "I regrettably haven't properly trained in quite a while," I admitted between labored breaths, trying to maintain some dignity. Obviously apparent to everyone watching, she stated matter-of-factly. She extended a hand professionally wrapped in black boxing tape. "I'm Chloe Martinez. I personally teach the evening conditioning classes and advanced technique sessions." "Michael Hartman," I responded, shaking her hand and noting her impressively firm grip that communicated serious capability. "Well, Michael Hartman, if you're genuinely planning to come back after whatever extended hiatus you've clearly been on, at least do it properly with correct technique. Your shoulders are unnecessarily tense, which wastes energy, and you're going to eventually blow out your knee joints jumping with that flawed landing pattern." There was something refreshingly direct about her professional bluntness that caught me off guard. No passive-aggressive comments disguised as concern. No hidden agenda beneath her words. Just straightforward technical criticism aimed at improvement. "Show me the correct approach," I requested, genuinely interested in her expertise. She raised a skeptical eyebrow, then stepped forward decisively. "Consciously relax your shoulders and upper trapezius muscles. Keep your elbows properly tucked in toward your rib cage. Land consistently on the balls of your feet rather than crashing down on your heels, which transfers damaging shock through your entire skeletal structure." I adjusted my positioning according to her instructions, immediately feeling the biomechanical difference in efficiency. "Marginally better execution," she nodded with professional assessment, but still objectively awful compared to proper technical standards. I laughed genuinely at her refreshing honesty. Thanks for that confidence-building assessment of my abilities. If you're specifically looking for empty compliments and participation trophies, join a trendy yoga studio downtown, she replied directly, though I detected a subtle hint of amusement in her evaluating eyes. If you actually want to significantly improve performance metrics, attend my specialized class tomorrow evening at 6. We focus on fundamentals and conditioning. Before I could formulate a proper response, she walked purposefully away, already focused on wrapping the hands of another gym member with professional attention. I returned to the gym the following day with unexpected anticipation, and the day after that as well. By the end of that first week, my entire body ached in ways I'd completely forgotten were physically possible, but my mind felt remarkably clearer and more focused than it had been in countless years of corporate routine. Chloe proved to be a consistently demanding instructor who never unnecessarily sugar-coated her technical assessments. But there was something increasingly liberating about her straightforward approach to training and life generally. If you're genuinely committed to striking something effectively, commit to the motion completely through proper follow-through, she instructed during one particularly challenging session, as I somewhat half-heartedly punched a heavy bag with diminishing energy. The same fundamental principle applies universally. Either commit fully to your chosen path, or don't waste everyone's valuable time pretending. Is that your comprehensive philosophical approach to absolutely everything in life? I asked while catching my breath between combinations. She shrugged with characteristic directness. Has consistently worked successfully for me thus far, without unnecessary complications. I fundamentally don't believe in doing anything halfway. Either strike with everything you've legitimately got behind the motion, or consciously walk away without regrets. Either live your life fully aligned with your authentic values, or don't complain about feeling persistently empty and unfulfilled. Her uncompromising words resonated with me long after I left the energizing environment of the gym. I gradually realized I'd been existing in an unsatisfying half-state for years, not fully committed to salvaging my increasingly dysfunctional marriage, because deep down I recognized it was fundamentally broken beyond simple repair, but not brave enough to decisively walk away from the comfortable familiarity of mutual unhappiness. That evening, Emily unexpectedly called for the first time since she'd departed nearly 2 weeks previously. Seeing her name suddenly appearing on my screen sent a familiar automatic jolt of anxiety through my nervous system. A conditioned response developed from years of dreading what unpredictable mood might await me on the other end of the connection. "Hello," I answered, surprised by how steady and centered my voice sounded even to my own ears. "Michael," she responded, her tone noticeably tight with contained frustration. "I've been consistently texting you for days and barely receiving minimal responses. What exactly is happening with you?" "Nothing particularly unusual is happening," I replied truthfully with newfound calmness. "I've simply been increasingly busy with various activities." "Too preoccupied to properly communicate with your actual wife?" The accusatory edge in her tone was immediately recognizable from countless previous interactions. "Emily, you specifically requested personal space and separation. I'm respectfully giving us both the distance you clearly stated you needed for self-discovery. I obviously didn't mean for you to completely ignore my existence," she countered, her voice rising slightly with indignation. "I still reasonably expect to know what's currently happening in your daily life during this temporary separation. I'm focusing on work projects with renewed energy. I started seriously training at the boxing gym again after years away. I'm systematically restoring the Harley-Davidson that's been sitting neglected in our garage." Each simple declarative statement felt like a small personal declaration of independence from her constant judgment. There was a noticeably long pause on the connection. "The motorcycle project? I thought we had thoroughly discussed and mutually agreed that was an impractical waste of your limited free time and our financial resources." "No, Emily, you unilaterally decided that without genuine consideration from my perspective. I simply stopped voicing my objections to maintain temporary household peace." Another lengthy silence stretched between us, heavier with unspoken tensions. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed tone completely, adopting a softer, deliberately vulnerable quality I hadn't heard genuinely expressed in years of calculated interactions. "You sound noticeably different lately, Michael." "Do I really seem that changed?" I asked with genuine curiosity. "Yes, considerably so. You sound emotionally distant and detached from us." I thoughtfully considered this observation for a revealing moment. "I'm not intentionally being cold or distant, Emily. I'm simply not performing artificial enthusiasm anymore to maintain your comfort with the situation you created." What exactly is that accusation supposed to imply? The defensive edge immediately returned to her voice with predictable quickness. "It simply means I'm done pretending everything's perfectly fine between us when we both know that's fundamentally untrue. You specifically requested this pause for space to find yourself without constraints. I'm honestly doing exactly the same thing on my own terms. By fixing a motorcycle and completely ignoring your concerned wife?" Her voice noticeably cracked with what sounded like genuine emotion. "By deliberately remembering who I authentically am outside of being exclusively defined as your increasingly accommodating husband," I said quietly, echoing her own justification back to her with deliberate precision. The uncomfortable silence that followed seemed heavy with previously unspoken accusations from both sides. "I'm returning home next week," she finally announced with finality. "My project is unexpectedly wrapping up earlier than initially projected." I felt a sudden tightness constricting my chest that I immediately recognized as genuine dread rather than anticipated relief. A revealing emotional response that spoke volumes about our actual relationship dynamics. "Please let me know your specific flight details when confirmed," I responded with carefully maintained neutrality. "I'll make appropriate arrangements." "Is that, seriously, it just okay and nothing more meaningful?" The disappointment in her tone was palpable through the connection. "What specifically would you prefer me to say that wouldn't sound performative, Emily?" "I don't know. Perhaps that you genuinely miss me? That you're sincerely looking forward to seeing me again after this separation?" I closed my eyes momentarily, recognizing that even now, she was primarily demanding emotional reassurance without offering any comparable vulnerability in return. "Safe travels when you depart," I said with measured calmness. "Good night, Emily." I deliberately ended the call before she could formulate a manipulative response and sat contemplatively in the peaceful silence of my living room. The unmistakable dread I'd experienced at the mere thought of her imminent return was profoundly revealing. These liberating weeks without her constant criticism, without walking anxiously on emotional eggshells, had been genuinely transformative. Like finally surfacing for essential air after nearly drowning in toxic expectations for years without recognizing the damage. I realized with growing certainty that I couldn't willingly return to that suffocating underwater existence now that I'd remembered how breathing freely actually felt. The morning Emily was scheduled to return, I methodically cleaned the house out of deeply ingrained habit rather than genuine anticipation. As I vacuumed the living room thoroughly, I suddenly realized with surprise that I'd unconsciously moved her numerous decorative pillows from the couch to create comfortable space for myself without constant adjustment. I'd subtly rearranged the furniture positioning to better accommodate television viewing, rather than maintaining her preferred conversation flow arrangement that supposedly facilitated meaningful interaction. Small physical changes that reflected much larger psychological transformations happening within me during her absence. I heard the distinctive sound of tires crunching on our driveway gravel and glanced through the front window to observe a taxi pulling to a stop. Emily emerged looking characteristically immaculate in a professionally tailored blazer and designer sunglasses, despite the presumed exhaustion of an overnight transatlantic flight. She efficiently paid the driver and wheeled her expensive matching luggage toward the front entrance with determined purpose. I deliberately opened the door before she could insert her key into the lock, standing somewhat awkwardly in the threshold. "Welcome back," I said simply, stepping aside to allow her entry into the space. She paused momentarily, carefully studying my expression as if searching for something specific in my features. Then she stepped forward confidently and attempted to kiss me directly on the lips, as though nothing significant had transpired between us. I instinctively turned slightly, causing her kiss to land uncomfortably on my cheek instead of its intended target. A brief flash of surprised hurt crossed her perfectly composed face before she quickly recovered her practiced poise. The entire flight was absolutely dreadful. Persistent turbulence throughout the entire Atlantic crossing made sleep completely impossible. Would you prefer some coffee to help with jet lag, or do you need immediate rest instead? I asked with polite detachment. Coffee would be wonderful right now, she responded, glancing around the living room with growing awareness of the subtle alterations made during her absence. In our kitchen, I could feel her evaluating gaze following my movements as I methodically prepared the French press, a culinary skill I deliberately perfected during her revealing absence. You've noticeably changed several things around the house, she finally observed with carefully measured neutrality. Just minor adjustments for practical functionality, I acknowledged. The decorative pillows I specially purchased during our Santa Fe vacation seem to have completely disappeared from the main seating area. They've been relocated to the guest bedroom, I explained matter-of-factly. They weren't particularly comfortable for daily use when watching television or reading. She frowned slightly with evident disapproval. They weren't specifically intended to be functionally comfortable, Michael. They were selected as coordinating decorative accessories for the overall design aesthetic. Well, they're currently decorating the guest room quite effectively instead, I responded without apologetic justification. I handed her a steaming mug of freshly pressed coffee, our fingers briefly brushing during the exchange. The momentary contact didn't trigger the familiar electric connection I'd once consistently felt in her presence. Instead, I experienced a noticeable emotional nothing. Complete detachment where attachment had once existed. Emily took a contemplative sip while maintaining steady eye contact over the rim of her mug. You've changed significantly, too, in unexpected ways. I leaned casually against the kitchen counter with newfound confidence. 3 weeks of separation provides considerable opportunity for personal reflection. Not particularly extensive time for fundamental transformation, she countered with skepticism. Apparently long enough to gain meaningful perspective on certain situations that previously seemed unchangeable. She deliberately set her mug down with precision. What exactly is that cryptic statement supposed to imply about us? It simply means I've had substantial time to think seriously too, Emily, about our relationship dynamics, about what I genuinely want moving forward rather than merely accepting. Her posture visibly stiffened with defensive tension. And what exactly do you supposedly want that you weren't previously receiving? Authentic honesty would make an excellent starting point for meaningful change, I said directly. Why did you really request this convenient pause in our marriage when it clearly wasn't about personal reflection? Emily looked away evasively, her manicured fingers nervously tracing the rim of her coffee mug. I already explained my reasons completely. I legitimately needed personal space to process complicated feelings. About what specific aspects? About our relationship future? About your independent career aspirations? Or perhaps about someone else entirely who's recently entered the picture? I pressed with uncharacteristic directness. Her head snapped up defensively. What exactly are you implying with that accusation? I'm not indirectly implying anything whatsoever. I'm asking you directly with complete transparency. Is there someone else who's complicating your commitment to our marriage? Absolutely not, she exclaimed emphatically, though her eyes darted away suspiciously quickly upon denial. How could you seriously think that about me after everything we built together? Because you've been emotionally distant for months preceding this separation? Because you suddenly required personal space immediately before a conveniently timed international trip where you'd be thousands of miles from accountability? Because your communication became increasingly vague and abbreviated during your absence? Those observations absolutely don't indicate infidelity, she stated defensively with rising indignation. I specifically didn't accuse you of physical cheating. I simply asked if another person has emotionally complicated your perspective on our marriage. Emily's telling silence provided the unspoken confirmation I'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to directly confront. Who exactly is he? I asked with surprising emotional detachment, given the circumstances. She looked down at her hands in apparent resignation. The situation isn't what you're automatically assuming. We haven't actually done anything inappropriate physically. He's simply a professional colleague in the London office. We connect intellectually in ways that... She hesitantly trailed off, perhaps realizing how remarkably revealing her attempted justification sounded. In ways that we apparently don't anymore, I finished her incomplete thought with uncomfortable accuracy. That comparison isn't entirely fair to what we've established together. You and I naturally have different intellectual interests and professional focuses. That's completely normal in any long-term committed relationship. She took a deliberate step toward me with placating intent. Michael, I genuinely came home because I finally realized what truly matters most. Us, our shared history together. Did you sleep with him during your convenient pause from our marriage? The direct question emerged before I could reconsider its bluntness. Emily's face flushed with apparent embarrassment or possibly guilt. Absolutely not. I specifically told you it wasn't remotely like that between us professionally. But you seriously considered crossing that boundary, I stated perceptively. The statement wasn't phrased as a question requiring confirmation. Her continued silence provided all the uncomfortable confirmation necessary regarding her conflicted intentions. I took a steadying breath before continuing. Emily, I believe we need to be completely honest with ourselves about our actual situation. This so-called pause was never genuinely about finding yourself through introspection. It represented you testing whether the proverbial grass might be greener elsewhere, while conveniently maintaining me as a comfortable backup plan if your exploration proved disappointing. Tears visibly welled in her carefully made-up eyes with what appeared as genuine emotion. That accusation isn't remotely true about my intentions. I genuinely love you despite recent complications. Perhaps you do still care in your particularly conditional way, but you fundamentally don't respect me as an equal partner anymore. And I've finally realized through this separation that I unquestionably deserve substantially better treatment than I've been accepting lately. She reached desperately for my hand with pleading intensity. Please understand my perspective, Michael. We can absolutely work through these temporary difficulties together. Couples therapy, a romantic vacation reconnection, whatever substantial changes might help repair things between us. I gently but firmly withdrew my hand from her grasping attempt. The fundamental problem is, I'm no longer convinced I actually want to invest more emotional energy repairing what's been broken for far longer than either of us has been willing to honestly acknowledge. Her expression transformed dramatically then, the temporary vulnerability instantly vanishing, replaced by a coldly familiar calculation I'd seen countless times throughout our deteriorating relationship. So that's seriously your final position? I responsibly ask for a few weeks of reasonable space for reflection, and you're completely ready to callously discard 10 years of marriage without even attempting reconciliation? Her voice carried accusatory venom designed to trigger my long-established guilt response. No, Emily. You effectively discarded our partnership long before formally requesting this revealing pause. I was simply too emotionally invested to recognize the obvious signs of your growing detachment until gaining necessary perspective during your convenient absence. She stared at me with narrowing, suspicious eyes. You've obviously met someone else during our separation. That's what this sudden independence is actually about, isn't it? I nearly laughed aloud at her transparent psychological projection of her own emotional infidelity. This situation isn't remotely about anyone else influencing my perspective. This represents me finally seeing our relationship dynamics with painful clarity after years of willful blindness. Who exactly is she? Emily demanded insistently, her voice rising with unconcealed jealousy. I deserve to know who's destroyed our marriage while I was working internationally. There isn't another woman driving my decisions, I stated firmly, though Chloe's honest directness briefly contrasted with Emily's manipulations in my mind. But your immediate accusatory assumption reveals considerable insight into where your thoughts naturally gravitate regarding commitment. Emily angrily grabbed her half-empty coffee mug and strode purposefully to the sink, forcefully dumping the remaining contents with theatrical emphasis. I absolutely refuse to continue this unproductive conversation right now. I'm completely jet-lagged and physically exhausted, and you're clearly not approaching this situation with reasonable emotional perspective. Actually, I believe I'm thinking more clearly and objectively than I have in several years of increasing compromise, I responded with calm certainty. She brushed dismissively past me toward the staircase. We'll resume this important discussion when you've properly calmed down and regained rational perspective on what truly matters between us. I silently watched her departure as she struggled to drag her heavy suitcase up the stairs without my offered assistance. Previously, I would have immediately rushed to help, apologized profusely for upsetting her emotional equilibrium, and worked tirelessly to smooth over the conflict, regardless of underlying validity. Today, I simply allowed her to experience the natural consequences of her actions without rescuing her from uncomfortable reality. Later that evening, I distinctly heard her crying dramatically in our bedroom, a sound that would have once sent me rushing to provide comfort and reassurance regardless of circumstance. Now I recognize the familiar pattern for what it frequently represented, a calculated tool designed to elicit sympathetic guilt and emotional manipulation. I deliberately inserted earbuds, played some classic blues that had always centered my thoughts, and continued methodically working on motorcycle restoration parts in the garage sanctuary until well past midnight with newfound purpose. The next morning, Emily appeared with theatrical pleasantness over breakfast. A manipulative tactic I immediately recognized from countless previous conflicts requiring resolution. She had prepared elaborate coffee with precise attention to my preferences and was wearing the blue cashmere sweater I'd once mentioned appreciatively as particularly flattering. I believe we got unnecessarily off track during yesterday's conversation, she began with practiced casualness while sliding a plate of perfectly prepared toast toward me. Jet lag combined with heightened emotions created an unfortunate dynamic between us. I accepted the offered toast with polite detachment, but made no move to actually consume it. Emily, we need to have an honest conversation about our actual situation. Her carefully composed smile faltered almost imperceptibly. Of course we should talk openly, but first I brought something special for you from London. She enthusiastically pushed an elegantly gift-wrapped package across the table with obvious expectation. I opened the expensive package methodically to discover a high-end designer watch, precisely the luxury style I would have once greatly appreciated as a thoughtful gift. Now it seemed transparently transactional, rather than genuinely meaningful. Thank you for thinking of me, I said sincerely, setting the expensive timepiece aside without any attempt to try it on or express disproportionate gratitude. Don't you want to wear it immediately? She asked with poorly concealed disappointment at my measured reaction. Emily, I've been doing considerable thinking while you were away exploring options. About us, about what we've gradually become as partners. She reached across the table with practiced vulnerability to grasp my hand. I completely understand your perspective. Nothing has been absolutely perfect between us lately, but every committed marriage naturally experiences challenging periods requiring mutual effort. This isn't simply a temporary rough patch requiring standard maintenance, I clarified, gently withdrawing my hand from her persistent grasp. This represents an established pattern of dysfunction. We fundamentally aren't creating happiness together anymore. We haven't genuinely connected as equal partners for considerably longer than either of us has been willing to honestly acknowledge. That assessment isn't remotely accurate about our relationship, she protested with immediate defensiveness. We've methodically built an enviable life together with substantial shared achievements and future plans. Your carefully crafted plans primarily, I corrected with newfound clarity. Your vision that I've been expected to accommodate myself into without meaningful input. Emily's expression hardened noticeably at this accurate observation. That's completely unfair characterization. I've made numerous significant compromises throughout our marriage. Name specifically one meaningful example, I challenged directly. One significant instance where you've genuinely compromised your preferences for my happiness within the past year of our marriage. She opened her mouth to respond automatically, then closed it again without specific examples. After an uncomfortable pause, she deflected. Healthy relationships aren't fundamentally about maintaining scorecards of sacrifices, Michael. They're definitely not about one partner consistently surrendering their authentic needs and identity to maintain temporary peace either, I countered with quiet certainty. She abruptly stood with obvious frustration, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. So this is how you've productively spent your time while I was away working? building resentments instead of constructively focusing on potential solutions to our temporary challenges? No, I replied with maintained composure. I've been actively rediscovering who I fundamentally am without your constant criticism and judgment, without perpetually walking on emotional eggshells anticipating your next mood shift, without having to exhaustively justify every independent decision I make according to your arbitrary standards. That's seriously how you perceive me after everything we built? As some controlling, critical presence in your life? Her voice elevated with practiced indignation, designed to trigger guilt. I increasingly recognize you as someone who's fundamentally never satisfied with present circumstances. Nothing I genuinely accomplish ever meets your shifting expectations. You're perpetually focused on the next acquisition, the next professional achievement, the next status symbol rather than appreciating what's already present. I gestured toward the expensive watch she'd presented. Purchasing expensive gifts that attempt to paper over the widening cracks in our relationship foundation doesn't address underlying structural problems. Tears welled dramatically in her eyes with practiced timing. I specifically purchased that thoughtful gift because I genuinely love and missed you during our separation. Did you genuinely miss my presence? Or did you primarily miss the security and stability of having me reliably waiting at home while you explored potentially exciting alternatives elsewhere? That assessment is deliberately cruel and unfair, she whispered with apparent hurt. It represents uncomfortable honesty, I countered firmly. Something we haven't genuinely shared with each other for considerable time. Emily paced the kitchen with uncharacteristic emotional transparency, running manicured hands through her carefully styled hair, a rare display of genuine emotion rather than calculated performance for strategic effect. I acknowledge making a serious mistake in judgment, she finally admitted reluctantly. I was temporarily confused and admittedly flattered by unexpected attention from someone else in a professional context. But absolutely nothing inappropriate physically occurred between us, and I deliberately chose to return home to you instead of pursuing that potential connection. Doesn't that conscious choice count meaningfully toward reconciliation? It might have previously carried significant weight, I acknowledge with honesty, but these past revealing weeks have demonstrated something important I can't ignore. I'm objectively happier without our dysfunctional dynamic, Emily. More authentically myself without constant performance requirements. The unvarnished truth hung heavily between us in the kitchen's charged atmosphere. Emily stared at me with stunned disbelief, as though I'd physically struck her without warning. You can't possibly mean that with serious consideration, she said, her voice barely audible with shock. I do mean it, with complete conviction, and I believe on deeper reflection, you're probably happier without my presence too. You simply don't appreciate me being the one to acknowledge our fundamental incompatibility first. That's absolutely untrue in every possible way, she protested vehemently. I genuinely love you completely. I've always loved you despite temporary complications. But you fundamentally don't respect me as an equal partner, I observed quietly. And without mutual respect as foundation, love eventually transforms into unhealthy dependence rather than growth. Emily collapsed back into her chair with visible emotional surrender, tears streaming unchecked down her carefully made-up face. Please reconsider, Michael. We can definitely repair this situation together. Professional therapy, a complete relationship reset, absolutely anything necessary to rebuild trust. I took a steadying breath before continuing with difficult truth. I've already consulted with a family law attorney regarding options. Her head snapped up with shocked betrayal. You've done what behind my back? I believe we should pursue an amicable divorce with fair division of assets, cleanly and respectfully, without unnecessary antagonism. A permanent divorce? She repeated incredulously, as though testing how the devastating word physically felt emerging from her lips. Over a 3-week temporary separation? Over one momentary lapse in judgment that never actually materialized into inappropriate behavior? No, I said with gentle firmness. Over years of accumulated small cruelties and manipulations. Over a fundamental incompatibility in values and communication that we've both been desperately ignoring through performance. Emily's temporary vulnerability instantly transformed into familiar anger with practiced quickness. You've obviously been methodically planning this betrayal throughout our separation, haven't you? You cynically viewed my business trip as convenient opportunity for abandonment. You were simply waiting for any reasonable excuse to discard our marriage. That characterization isn't remotely accurate, I corrected calmly. I genuinely didn't recognize the extent of my dissatisfaction until experiencing the stark contrast of your absence without constant emotional management. My supposed negative influence, she scoffed dismissively. You describe our dynamic as though I've been systematically brainwashing you rather than building partnership. Not with deliberate malicious intent, I clarified, but you've developed a consistent pattern of making everything my responsibility to fix regardless of origin, of subtly twisting situations until I'm invariably apologizing, even when completely blameless in creating conflict. She stood abruptly with theatrical emphasis, deliberately knocking over her coffee mug in apparent frustration. Dark liquids spread rapidly across the table surface, but neither of us moved immediately to contain the symbolic mess. I absolutely refuse to continue participating in this irrational conversation, she declared with finality. You're clearly experiencing some kind of psychological crisis requiring professional intervention. I'm 34 years old, Emily. This isn't a stereotypical midlife crisis scenario requiring dismissive categorization. Whatever convenient label applies to your current behavior, I refuse further engagement with it. Take necessary time for serious reflection. Carefully consider exactly what meaningful relationship you're callously discarding without proper consideration. I maintain composed certainty despite her escalating emotional tactics. I've had 3 uninterrupted weeks to thoroughly examine our dynamics with clarity. My perspective is firmly established regarding our incompatibility. Emily angrily grabbed her designer purse from the kitchen counter with dramatic flourish. I'm temporarily staying at Jessica's apartment until you regain rational perspective. Contact me when you're prepared to have a productive conversation about actual reconciliation rather than destruction. As she purposefully strode toward the front door, she turned back with calculated parting accusation. For your information regarding compromises, I deliberately remained in Austin for your benefit when I received that attractive job offer in Chicago 2 years ago that would have advanced my career significantly. You repeatedly stated that position represented a lateral move at best by your own assessment, I reminded her accurately. You primarily used it as manipulative leverage to generate guilt rather than genuine consideration. Her face flushed with visible anger, perhaps at being directly confronted with her transparent manipulation tactics. Without further argument, she dramatically slammed the door behind her retreating figure with theatrical finality. I remained seated alone in the suddenly peaceful kitchen, observing the spilled coffee continuing its symbolic spread across the formerly pristine table surface. I expected to experience overwhelming guilt, paralyzing regret, or crushing anxiety following this confrontation. Instead, I felt primarily profound relief washing through me, like the aftermath of a devastating storm that had been ominously threatening for years and had finally broken with cleansing intensity. I deliberately stood and began methodically cleaning the physical mess left in Emily's dramatic wake, reflecting on how perfectly symbolic this moment truly was. For countless years, I'd been routinely cleaning up emotional messes she deliberately created through manipulation and control. This would represent the final instance requiring my attention before genuine freedom.